Racist cop brings the wrong black man to court, then shockingly discovers he's a federal prosecutor. The evening air was thick with humidity, a slow-moving summer night that left the streets of downtown Atlanta humming with activity. Officer Brad Keller sat in his squad car, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel, scanning the sidewalk through half-lidded eyes. The night had been uneventful so far, just a couple of noise complaints and a report of a stolen bicycle. Routine stuff. Then, through the windshield, he caught sight of a figure walking briskly through the parking lot behind the courthouse. His pulse quickened. The man matched the description from an earlier radio call. A tall black male in his 40s, dark jacket, possibly linked to a series of thefts downtown. Keller didn't hesitate. He reached for his radio. "I've got him," he muttered, opening the car door and stepping out. His boots scuffed against the pavement as he closed the distance. "Sir," he called, his voice edged with authority. "Stop right there." The man slowed but didn't freeze, his posture poised but not defensive. He turned slightly, his face partially illuminated by a flickering street lamp. He was well-dressed. Too well-dressed for a typical suspect, Keller thought. A tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes, and a briefcase in hand. The man didn't look startled. If anything, his expression was unreadable, composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice even. Keller rested his hand on his belt, close to his holster. "We received reports of a suspect matching your description involved in a string of thefts downtown. I need to see some ID." A long pause followed. The man's jaw tightened slightly before he reached into his pocket with slow, deliberate movements. He pulled out his wallet and handed Keller a driver's license. The officer barely glanced at the name before turning it over. His focus was still locked on the man's face, searching for any flicker of nervousness, any telltale sign of guilt. "Where are you coming from?" Keller asked. The man exhaled, the slightest trace of frustration in his breath. "My office." Keller raised an eyebrow. "Your office, huh? And where exactly is that?" The man nodded toward the courthouse behind them. "Right there." Keller stiffened. The courthouse? That made no sense. He studied the man again, the crispness of his suit, the quiet confidence in his posture. He didn't fit the profile of a petty criminal. But the description matched, and Keller had been a cop long enough to trust his instincts. Something about the way this man carried himself rubbed him the wrong way, like he wasn't afraid, like he thought he was above this. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Keller ordered, his tone clipped. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his gaze sharpened. "Officer, I'd advise you to think very carefully about what you're doing." Keller scoffed. "That so?" "You're making a mistake," the man said plainly. Keller smirked, snapping the handcuffs from his belt. "Yeah, well, that's not for you to decide." He gripped the man's wrist, expecting resistance. But there was none. The man allowed himself to be cuffed without a struggle, his movements controlled, methodical. Keller didn't like it. The way he remained so still, so composed, it was unnerving. His partner, Officer Hernandez, approached, his brows knit together. "Everything good here?" Keller nodded. "Got our guy?" Hernandez glanced at the man. Something about the scene made him hesitate. "You sure?" "Matches the description," Keller muttered, tightening the cuffs slightly. The man let out a slow breath. "You're going to regret this." Keller chuckled. "We'll see about that." They walked toward the courthouse entrance, the sound of the man's polished shoes clicking against the pavement with each step. Inside, the buzz of courtroom activity swirled around them. Clerks filing paperwork, lawyers chatting in hushed tones, the distant hum of a judge's voice presiding over a trial. But as they stepped deeper into the building, the energy in the room shifted. Whispers rippled through the small crowd as people took notice of the arrest. "Wait, is that?" someone murmured. Keller ignored them. He guided the man toward the main corridor, leading him toward booking. But before they could take another step, a commanding voice rang out. "Officer Keller, what the hell are you doing?" Keller turned, irritation flickering across his face. Standing at the far end of the hall was Judge Harold Whitmore, his robe draped over his shoulders, a scowl creasing his face. Keller tightened his grip on the man's arm. Bringing in a suspect, Your Honor. Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Then he glanced at the man in cuffs. A suspect, he echoed, disbelief in his tone. Do you even know who that is? Keller frowned. Yeah, some guy who thinks he's too good to answer questions. The man, still calm, turned his head slightly toward Keller. Would you like to introduce me, Judge, or should I do it myself? Keller's stomach clenched. Judge Whitmore let out a slow breath. Uncuff him, right now. Keller hesitated, his pulse quickening. Sir? Now, the judge barked, his voice firm. Keller's fingers fumbled with the cuffs as he hurried to unlock them. The moment the metal clicked free, the man rolled his shoulders slightly before adjusting the cuffs of his suit. I tried to warn you, the man said evenly. Keller swallowed hard. Who the hell are you? The man turned, standing to his full height. Then, with a smooth, practiced motion, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his identification, holding it up for Keller to see. Jonathan Pierce, he said, his voice calm but edged with authority. Federal Prosecutor, Department of Justice. Keller felt the blood drain from his face. The air in the courthouse seemed to still, as if the entire building had paused to watch this moment unfold. Jonathan Pierce, one of the most well-known prosecutors in the country, a man who had taken down corrupt politicians, exposed fraudulent corporations, and sent career criminals to prison for life. And Keller had just arrested him for no reason other than fitting a vague description. The weight of his mistake settled like lead in his stomach. Jonathan's gaze was unreadable as he slid his ID back into his pocket. Now, Officer Keller, he said smoothly, I think it's time we have a conversation about wrongful arrests, don't you? And with that, the tables turned. For the first time that night, it wasn't Jonathan Pierce who looked like he was on trial. It was Officer Brad Keller. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Officer Brad Keller stood at the witness stand, his shoulders squared in forced confidence. The wooden benches creaked as people leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. The arrest of Federal Prosecutor Jonathan Pierce had become the talk of the courthouse. And now, Keller was expected to justify himself in front of the same legal professionals who had worked alongside Pierce for years. Judge Harold Whitmore sat at the bench, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his glasses and looked over the case file. At the defense table, Jonathan Pierce sat calmly, his fingers lightly interlocked as he listened. His expression was neutral, but there was no mistaking the power he carried in that room. He wasn't just another man wrongly accused, he was a symbol of everything Keller had failed to consider before slapping handcuffs on him the night before. Officer Keller, the judge finally said, his voice heavy with authority, please walk us through your reasoning for the arrest. Keller cleared his throat, his palms suddenly sweaty. Your Honor, we received reports of a series of petty thefts in the downtown area. Witnesses described the suspect as a tall black male, early 40s, wearing a dark jacket. When I saw Mr. Pierce in the parking lot, he matched that description. Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat, a single eyebrow lifting. That's all it took? His voice was steady, but it carried an edge sharp enough to slice through the officer's remaining confidence. Keller hesitated. It was the description fit, sir. Did you ask any follow-up questions? Jonathan continued, his tone casual but his words deliberate. Did you ask me where I was coming from before assuming I was a thief? Did you check surveillance footage? Did you even bother to verify whether I had any reason to be in that parking lot, outside the courthouse where I work? Keller's jaw tightened. I was following standard procedure. Jonathan exhaled sharply, a small shake of his head betraying his frustration. Officer, if this is standard procedure, then we have a much bigger problem than my wrongful arrest. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The weight of the statement settled over everyone in the room, forcing them to acknowledge the ugly truth lingering beneath the surface. How many other men had stood in Jonathan's place, their dignity stripped away because of vague descriptions and snap judgments? The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Mr. Pierce, you're dangerously close to making this personal. Jonathan's eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time his composure cracked just slightly. Your Honor, it is personal. Because if this had happened to someone without my title, without my resources, without the ability to defend themselves in this very courtroom, do you think they'd be sitting here today? Or would they be sitting in a holding cell, hoping the system decides to treat them fairly? Keller felt his stomach twist. This was no longer just about him. This was about something bigger, something he hadn't even considered when he tightened those handcuffs. And now there was no undoing what had been done. The courtroom's heavy silence weighed on Officer Brad Keller as he stood at the witness stand, his carefully built confidence unraveling thread by thread. Just hours ago, he had been certain of his arrest, convinced that he had caught a suspect who fit the description, a black man in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket. That was all it took. But now, standing under the piercing scrutiny of both the judge and the man he had wrongly detained, the situation felt far less straightforward. Jonathan Pierce sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable, his fingers interlaced on the wooden surface before him. There was no hostility in his posture, no raised voice or angry accusations, but it was the quiet control, the certainty of his presence, that unsettled Keller the most. Jonathan wasn't here to plead for understanding. He was here to expose the fault lines in a system Keller had always believed in. The judge turned his attention back to Keller, his gaze sharp. "Officer, before you made the arrest, did you verify the suspect's identity?" Keller hesitated. I believed I had probable cause." Jonathan let out a soft breath, tilting his head slightly. "Belief," he repeated. "Not evidence, not facts, just a feeling." Keller's fingers curled against the wooden rail of the stand, his grip tightening. "I was operating off of the information we had." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "Information," he echoed. "A vague description, no surveillance footage, no questioning of witnesses for additional details. Just a broad assumption that a black man in a suit outside a courthouse must be your suspect." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Keller's face burned. He had been so sure, so certain. But hearing it laid out like this, his reasoning sounded flimsy, reckless even. The judge leaned forward, his fingers tapping against his desk. "Mr. Pierce," he said slowly, "if this case is as baseless as you claim, what exactly do you seek as a resolution?" Jonathan finally broke his stare from Keller and turned to the judge. His voice was calm but carried a weight that filled every inch of the room. "Your Honor, I don't want a simple apology. I want accountability. Because if this is how quickly an innocent man can be detained, how many others have been through the same without the ability to fight back?" Keller swallowed hard. He had thought this would be just another case, another arrest, another checkmark in his record. But now, as he stood exposed in the very courthouse where justice was supposed to be blind, he realized he had never really considered what that justice looked like for men like Jonathan Pierce. And perhaps, for the first time in his career, Keller found himself questioning whether he had ever really known the law at all. Officer Brad Keller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom pressing down on him. This was supposed to be simple, an open and shut case. He had detained a man who fit the description of a reported suspect. It should have been routine. Instead, he was now facing scrutiny he hadn't anticipated. Across the room, Jonathan Pierce sat with the same calm, unbothered demeanor he had carried since his wrongful arrest. His tailored suit was crisp, his posture upright, his fingers laced together as he listened carefully. Keller hated how composed he looked, how confident, like a man who knew the law inside and out. And he did, because Jonathan Pierce wasn't just another suspect. He was one of the most powerful federal prosecutors in the country, and Keller had arrested him based on nothing more than a vague description. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling through papers before leveling his gaze at Keller. "Officer, you claim to have probable cause for this arrest, yet the only evidence you presented was that Mr. Pierce vaguely matched a witness description. Tell me, was there anything else?" Keller hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. "Your Honor, we received multiple witness reports stating that a tall black male in his 40s was seen near the scene of the crime. Given the circumstances..." Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Tall black male in his 40s. That's it? No mention of clothing, facial features, distinguishing marks? Just that? Keller's throat tightened. He had been so sure earlier, but now, under the scrutiny of the courtroom, his reasoning felt weak. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his voice even but firm. Do you know how many men in this city fit that description, Officer Keller? How many innocent people walk these streets only to be stopped, questioned, or detained because of assumptions? Keller felt his face heat. I was doing my job. Jonathan's expression didn't waver. No, you were following a pattern. The same pattern that has led to wrongful arrests for years. The same pattern that could have destroyed my career, my reputation, and my life if I weren't in a position to defend myself. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The judge held up a hand, signaling for silence before turning his gaze back to Keller. Officer, when you made this arrest, did you at any point ask Mr. Pierce to identify himself before placing him under custody? Keller shifted in his seat. He exhaled sharply. No, Your Honor. Jonathan spread his hands. And there it is. You didn't check my ID. You didn't ask for clarification. You saw me, and in that moment, you decided I was guilty. Keller clenched his jaw. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but what was there to say? The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. Mr. Pierce, given the circumstances, what are you seeking as a resolution? Jonathan's gaze didn't leave Keller's. Change, he said simply. Accountability. If this is happening to someone like me, someone who understands the law, then I guarantee it's happening to men who don't have the resources to fight back. The room was silent as the weight of his words settled. Keller swallowed, realizing that this wasn't just about him. It never had been. The judge took a slow breath, then nodded. Officer Keller, I am ordering you to attend mandatory training on racial bias and procedural integrity. Additionally, I am requesting a review of your department's policies on detaining suspects based on vague descriptions. And you, Mr. Pierce, the judge gave him a measured look. Thank you for turning this into a lesson rather than a vendetta. Jonathan inclined his head, his gaze still steady. Justice isn't about revenge, Your Honor. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. Keller looked away, feeling the full weight of his mistake. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. It was about an entire system, one he had blindly trusted for too long. And for the first time, he wondered if he had been on the wrong side of justice all along. Jonathan Pierce walked out of the courthouse, his polished shoes tapping against the concrete steps as he descended into the waiting sea of reporters. The moment his wrongful arrest had made headlines, the city's media outlets had swarmed the courthouse, eager for a statement. Officer Brad Keller had arrested a federal prosecutor based on nothing more than a vague description. And now the department was under intense scrutiny. Cameras flashed, microphones extended toward him, but Jonathan remained composed. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had been wrongly accused, about every black man who had been stopped, questioned, or detained simply for existing. A reporter stepped forward. Mr. Pierce, how do you feel about the judge's ruling? Jonathan adjusted his tie, his gaze unwavering. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. Officer Keller isn't the problem. He's a symptom of something much bigger. Another voice rose from the crowd. Are you saying the police department is systemically biased? Jonathan let out a slow breath. I'm saying that when officers rely on instinct rather than evidence, when they default to assumptions instead of facts, the system fails. It's not just about one bad stop. It's about the unchecked power that allows it to happen over and over again. The crowd murmured. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. The conversation was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. From the edge of the crowd, Jonathan spotted Officer Keller standing stiffly, his arms crossed. He had expected the officer to avoid him after the courtroom exchange, but here he was, watching, listening. Jonathan met his gaze then against every expectation, walked toward him. You're not the first cop to do this, Jonathan said, his voice measured, but that doesn't mean you can't be the last. Keller exhaled sharply. I made a mistake? Jonathan nodded. You did, and mistakes have consequences. But the real question is, what are you going to do about it now? Keller didn't answer right away. The bravado that had fueled him in the courtroom was gone. He looked at Jonathan, truly looked at him, and for the first time he seemed to understand the weight of his actions. "I don't know," Keller admitted, his voice quieter than before. "I don't know where to start." Jonathan studied him for a moment, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Start here," he said, handing it over. Keller unfolded it, his brow furrowing. It was a list, names of organizations, civil rights initiatives, and bias training programs. "You don't have to like me," Jonathan continued, "but if you really want to serve and protect, then learn from this. Do better." For the first time, Keller didn't have a quick comeback. He simply nodded. Jonathan stepped back, giving him space. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was up to Keller. As Jonathan turned to leave, another reporter called out, "Mr. Pierce, what happens next?" Jonathan paused. "Change," he said firmly, "if we demand it." And with that, he walked away, leaving the crowd buzzing with questions and possibilities. Because justice wasn't just about what happened in a courtroom, it was about what happened next. Officer Brad Keller sat in the front row of the police department's mandatory bias training, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. The room was filled with other officers, some seasoned veterans like him, others fresh recruits who hadn't yet seen the uglier side of the job. The atmosphere was tense, thick with resentment and skepticism. No one wanted to be here, least of all him. At the front of the room, the instructor, a retired federal judge named Evelyn Carter, flipped through her notes. She had seen plenty of men like Keller before, officers who had spent years believing their instincts were infallible, who thought their mistakes were minor, excusable, even justified. But today, that belief would be tested. "Officer Keller," she said suddenly, lifting her eyes toward him. He stiffened. "Yes, ma'am?" She folded her hands on the table. "Let's talk about the case that landed you here." A few officers glanced in his direction. Keller clenched his jaw. It was a misidentification. The suspect matched the description. Judge Carter tilted her head slightly. "Did he?" Keller swallowed, shifting in his chair. "He was a tall black man in his 40s. He fit what we were given." She let the words linger before flipping the page in her folder. "Do you know how many men in this city fit that description, Officer Keller?" "I'll tell you," she continued. "Thousands. That's how many. And yet, you singled out Jonathan Pierce, a federal prosecutor, because your instinct told you he was the one." Keller exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. "I was doing my job." Judge Carter leaned forward. "Your job isn't to make assumptions, officer. It's to gather facts, to protect and serve, not to profile and detain based on a hunch." A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers nodded slightly, while others looked uncomfortable. Keller felt heat rise up his neck. He had spent his entire career trusting his gut. Wasn't that what they were trained to do? But now, for the first time, he was being forced to consider that his instincts weren't as reliable as he thought. Judge Carter pulled out a file and placed it on the table. "This isn't just about you, Officer Keller. This is about a pattern, a system that allows bias to go unchecked." She flipped it open, revealing a series of cases, names of men who had been stopped under similar circumstances. Most of them had never committed a crime. They had just fit the description. Keller's throat tightened. He had always believed himself to be a good cop. But looking at those files, at those names, he realized something unsettling. Good intentions didn't erase bad actions. Judge Carter's voice softened slightly. "Acknowledging the problem isn't weakness, Officer Keller. It's the first step toward doing better." For the first time since the training began, Keller uncrossed his arms. He wasn't sure if he was ready to admit he had been wrong, but he was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had something to learn. Jonathan Pierce stood outside the courthouse, his breath steady despite the weight of the moment. The press had already gathered, cameras flashing, microphones held out in anticipation of a statement. But Pierce wasn't here for spectacle. He was here for something much bigger. Officer Brad Keller approached, shoulders tense, his usual confidence noticeably absent. The last few months had been a reckoning for him. The investigation, the training, the public scrutiny, it had all forced him to confront things he had spent years ignoring. Now, he had no choice but to face the man he had wrongfully detained. "Mr. Pierce," Keller started, his voice quieter than usual. He stopped, exhaling sharply. "I came here to apologize." Pierce studied him, his gaze unreadable. "Go on." Keller swallowed hard. "I let my assumptions get in the way of my duty. I thought I was following procedure, but the truth is I was acting on bias. I didn't see you, I saw a suspect." The words hung between them. The crowd murmured, but Pierce didn't react. He let Keller sit with the weight of what he had just admitted. Finally, Pierce nodded. "Acknowledging it is the first step, Officer Keller, but an apology alone won't fix the system." Keller's jaw tensed. He knew that. He had spent weeks learning how deep the problem ran, how many others had suffered because of assumptions like his. "I know," Keller said, "and I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to do better. I want to be part of the change." Pierce held his gaze for a long moment before finally extending a hand. Keller hesitated, then shook it. "This isn't just about you or me," Pierce said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through it." As the cameras flashed, Keller knew this wasn't the end of his journey, but it was the moment that changed everything. Life teaches us that true wisdom comes not just from experience, but from the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Injustice is not always loud. Sometimes it hides in the quiet assumptions we make, the habits we never question, and the systems we trust without scrutiny. The story of Jonathan Pierce and Officer Keller is a reminder that change does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with the courage to listen, to acknowledge, and to grow. Keller's journey is one many of us can relate to, whether we realize it or not. We all have biases, shaped by our past, by the world we grew up in, by the things we were told and never questioned. But as Keller learned, recognizing a flaw is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of strength. The same holds true in our own lives. Whether we are dealing with our relationships, our communities, or even our own regrets, real change requires humility. It requires us to ask, what have I been blind to? And more importantly, what can I do about it?